Glad everybody's enjoying the cookies and coffee. Be sure and eat and drink a lot. We do have part of this kind of the celebration is everybody's getting back and getting into the swing of things. Also, we do have new members that are starting today. I'm going to read their names off, and then at the end, I'd like them to stand up so we can see who they all are. Their name tags will have a special star on them. So during the break, take a look and see if you see somebody with a star, go up and introduce yourself. And if you have a star, go up and introduce yourself to other people. If I mispronounce your name, please pull me aside and tell me how to pronounce it. Merritt Aubrey, Phyllis Cole, Scott Davis, Kathy Ellis Kellerman, Gail Gutzler, Kathy Kaspari, Lisa Sohnhem, Sohn? Okay. Lisa Sohn and Helmut Sohn. All right. Well, they've all introduced themselves. Welcome. Welcome. And if you would stand up. Yeah, so everybody can see you, like, yeah. All right. Thank you. Welcome, welcome, welcome. This is going to be an interesting day. We're going to have a presentation this morning and then a break. And if you wish, you can stick around at between 1 and 3:11. We will have a film of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. And later on, we're going to have a discussion. Next week on Thursday, we'll have a discussion about the film. So if you wish, and if you're able, you can stay, and it'll be right here. It starts promptly at 1 o'clock, I believe. So that will be fun. I remember when I was a kid, there was there's two stars at, what is it? Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton are in it, and The Big Deal. I was a teenager, I think, when it was made, and it was their love affair and all that, and I think it went on into Cleopatra and all that kind of stuff. So it was a big deal. So you can watch the tension between those two stars. For those new folks, lunch is usually at Gowdy. You can bring your lunch and eat it here, or you can go to Gowdy Commons and eat for $9.50. Let's see. I think that's it. Gwenella now has an announcement.
Just a quick announcement to let you know that Chemeketa Community College is having a coat drive. So they ask that you donate your gently used coats, jackets, and sweatshirts for students there and elsewhere. So if you have something like that and you want to bring it here, I'll collect it here, okay? And it goes until February 6th, so if you forget it next week, bring it the following week. Thank you for thinking of that. And for clearing out your clutter, right?
Excellent. And now Judy to introduce today's speaker.
Well, good morning and Happy New Year. It's great to see everyone here today. I wanted to introduce Dr. Larry Scruggs. I'm going to raise this up a little bit. Has anyone heard Dr. Scruggs speak before? Cassia, okay, and okay, some folks over there. Larry is a third-generation Oregonian. His great-grandmother came in a pioneer wagon to the area that became Prineville. He was born during World War II, and I think he was born at Camp White, just outside of Medford. Is that correct? Yes. Joined the Air Force in 1961 through 65. He served in Glasgow, Montana, and Fairbanks, Alaska. He went to Southern Oregon College in Ashland. He has a BS in law enforcement and an MS in general studies, social science, with an emphasis on constitutional law. He was a police officer in Ashland for 4 years, from 68 to 72. Great college years, as I remember. He's a graduate of the Oregon Police Academy, and he won the first ever academic award given by the Board of Police Standards and Training. He has a Ph.D. in Urban Studies from Portland State University, 1996. His major field areas are policy analysis and social change. His dissertation is on the subject of unrelated business enterprises by nonprofits. He was the director of auxiliary services from 75 to 96 at the University of Portland. He did all the things that no one else wants to do. Public safety, parking, conference office, bookstore, space allocation, and facilities coordination, and project manager for major construction. He developed the 1996 Campus Facilities Master Plan. I call him a Renaissance man. I don't know about you, but so far, In 97 to 2001, he was Vice President of Operations for RAS Transportation. In 2002 to 2008, he was Project Manager for Emmert International, relocating historic structures. He moved the Scholey Brothers Candy Factory in San Diego, the Odd Fellows Hall in Salt Lake City, and other projects. So why are we talking about oligarchy? Okay. Because he has a great interest in exploring the history not only of his family, say a great-grandmother who lived in the Gilded Age and then had to live through the Depression and World War II, the juxtapositions of all of these events in our history. He did retire in 2008, and he's been substitute teaching in the Salem-Keizer School District. Now, if that's not enough, he plays the 5-string banjo. He will celebrate his 60th anniversary in September of 26. He has 5 children, 7 grandchildren, and 1 great-grandchild. Okay, let's introduce Larry.
See how close I can get this. Can you all hear me if I talk from here? No. So I have to get down here? Okay. How's this if I talk like this? Okay. I do want to make one addition to the events happening that were on the calendar up here earlier. Yesterday was the celebration of the ratification of our Constitution. And something I think needs to be more emphasized. I also want to make one comment about the relocation of historical structures. When you actually move the building, like with the Oddfellows Hall, we moved it basically across the street. Total distance was about 300 yards. We moved it in about 2.5 hours, and everybody said, well, that was easy. You spend 6 months going through the drawings of the building and designing how you're going to pick it up, because older historical structures have reinforcement that places put in, concrete block walls and things of that nature. You have to really learn the weight. Then you design it. It takes you about 2 months to get all the steel, because you're talking 36-inch beams that might be 110 feet long. Those don't just float around. Anyway, it takes all that time to get it ready, and then you pick it up and whisk, you move it. Then it takes you about 6 months to set it back down because you have to build a foundation and all that. Anyway, to get to our subject at hand, one of the fun things about research is you never really know where you're going to wind up. This project started, I became very aware of the differences in our social structure and in the country and in the world that have occurred not only in my lifetime, but I went back to Grandma Georgia when she was a child and they settled in Prineville. She rode in a covered wagon. Her generation started out with no electricity, no automobiles, no airplanes, none of that stuff. And when they were having kids, my parents' generation, they were born during the Gilded Age, very similar to what we're in right now. But then they had to put up with the Great Depression, which changed their whole perspective on life. And so they had our generation, for those of us that are born from the 1940s and on. I can remember not so much World War II, but Korea. I can remember very clearly news about Korea. I had a neighbor who was a paratrooper during Korea. And then we had the 60s. And during this period of the 60s, everything was just wonderful. Well, there's a perspective issue here. But that's what got this whole project started. And as I was doing the work, and the more I kept reading, the more I kept running into the question of who made this happen. How is it that this came about? And that's when I started thinking about oligarchs and oligarchy. And so in the process of doing this, I want to acknowledge one other thing before we really get into it. I don't know everything there is to know about this. One of the things that I've learned is the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know. And there are probably people in this room that know more about this than I do. And some of the other things that we'll touch base with. And if you have a comment or if you want to add something to it during your allowed time, please do so we can all learn. This is a community discussion, okay? First thing we want to do is look at oligarchy. That's what we're going to discuss today. Oligarchy is a government by the few, especially despotic power exercised by a small and privileged group for selfish purposes, corrupt or selfish purposes. And it's interesting, one of the first use that I found of this term was with the Russian oligarchs after the fall of the Soviet Union. And so anyway, that's what we're going to talk about. And usually, remember, oligarchs are not those elected to public office, but rather the people who operate behind the scenes. And it's not autocracy we're talking about, it's really plutocracy, which is government or ruled by the oligarchs or by the small group of people. It can mean a people or person that are extremely rich and powerful. And has oligarchy been in the United States? Yes. In fact, there's really three distinct periods of oligarchy we're going to talk about. First is the agrarian or agricultural oligarchs of the late 1700s. And I will emphasize to the present because some of those fortunes are still around. We have the industrial oligarchs, also known as the robber barons, from the late 1800s to the present. Many of those fortunes are still around. And then we have the new signs of the Gilded Age, oligarchs from the late 1970s to the present. Many of those are what some people call the tech bros, the people involved with the technical industry. And note that all are identified from where they started and are still active today. And that's because as we're going to get farther on, we're going to talk about following the money. So there are also religious leaders that attempted to create a state religion. Most of them are various forms of Christianity, and while not true oligarchs, I will include a brief history during the founding of this country to explain what happened during that time and to give context for the current discussions about Christian nationalism. So there's three basic premises to this presentation. One is that the basic rule of analyzing public policy is follow the money. Always follow the money. I enjoy reading bills that are presented in front of the legislature and start listing down who benefits from this bill and who's excluded from the bill. And after a while you find out it always gets down to money. and oftentimes it gets down to prejudice. Oligarchy is the very antithesis of democracy, and the net result of oligarchical rule is always inequality, instability, and conflict. And we'll talk about these during the conversation we'll have here. There's basically 5 parts to this presentation. We're going to give a historical perspective of the freedoms and rights given to the landowners and wealthy merchants in English history. And I think this is important to see where we came from the year 1100 to today. There's a progression that I think is of interest. We're going to talk about the agrarian oligarchs and the founding of the United States of America. We'll talk about the post-Civil War and the advent of the industrial age and the accompanying appearance of the robber barons as the industrial oligarchs at the time. We're going to talk about the period following World War II in Korea, which I call a new age dawning. That's the area that we grew up in. Things were really pretty good right then. And then the last period will be bringing us up to today. Now, we've always had oligarchs in one form or another. And so to give you a brief historical perspective of thousands of years of development of civil rights and human rights in civilizations. In the earliest forms of organizations, when we were basically herds of people, whatever else you want to use to describe us at that time, there was always a leader. It was the alpha male or the alpha female. Oftentimes they were patriarchal, or in some instances matriarchal, but there was always some form of leadership. Over time, and as societies grew and trade developed, the wealthier people and the business leaders became more powerful and demanded representation, because there was always a king or the chief or whatever the term was for the leader, and that person usually had absolute authority. Well, after a while you had other people that really needed to have some insight and some say as to what was happening. Councils were formed to advise the chief king or queen, but the chief king or queen was always the ultimate authority. And then in the 1100s, the House of Lords, the upper chamber of the Great Britain's bicameral legislature, was formed when the Anglo-Saxon kings consulted witons, or councils, composed of religious leaders and the monarch's ministers. It emerged as a distinct element of parliament in the 13th and 14th centuries. Lords were appointed by the parliament in the 13th and 14th centuries. They were appointed by the king. They received lifetime appointments, and those appointments could be passed on to their heirs. Anyone know when England modified the House of Lords and took away the hereditarial? 1999. And there are still some positions in the House of Lords that are hereditary. Well, just ponder that. Anyway, 1215, the Magna Carta was signed. England was controlled by a king who was challenged by the landowners and the barons. There were 63 clauses in the Magna Carta, the most important being the king is not above the law, and people had the right to face charges in public. 1679, notice that's about 350 years later, habeas corpus became a law. No freeman shall be imprisoned except by the lawful judgment of his peers, or trial by the law of the land. In 1782, Rousseau published his book, The Social Contract. How many of you have read that in your coursework? Yeah, that was very influential to the people who founded this country. And in general terms, it discusses what are the rights of the society in controlling the individual, and what are the rights of the individual in controlling the society. And it basically, I think, is really important not only because of its influence, but it provides clarity in how a society could be organized and how it could be managed. 1775, we had the Declaration of Independence from English control over the colonies. 1777, the first Constitution passed. That was called the Articles of Confederation. In the Articles of Confederation, the power and control rested with the states and not the federal government, which basically neutered the federal government. It flatly did not work. So they went back to work, and in 1787, the Constitution was passed. Power rests with the federal government over the states, and the most important words are "we the people." First three words of the Constitution, I think, are the most important. As a side note, I've been really concerned because so many of our students really don't know much about the Constitution and about the laws. But I would actually make that larger. I would say most of the people of the United States don't know. I had a chance at Walker Middle School. I was teaching for 2 weeks, teaching social science. And the subject of the Constitution came up on the first day. I have an abbreviated version of the citizenship test in my possession. I gave the citizenship test to all of those students, and about half of them flunked it. I guess you could say flunked it. Anyway, we did 2 weeks on the Constitution, and then I gave them the test again, and they all passed. But I'd like to see, it's something I'd like to see incorporated into more schools. Start out your ninth grade or your 8th grade. That's a very good age to introduce that. Anyway, getting back to our timeline, in 1803, Marbury versus Madison, Supreme Court case defined the scope of the U.S. Congress's legislative power and how it relates to the powers of the states. 1803, Jefferson completes the Louisiana Purchase. And that's important because it was a huge expansion of the land available to the United States. During that time, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton had contrasting visions for America's future, and that's still going on today. Jefferson envisioned an agrarian society with small independent farmers, advocating for states' rights and minimal central government. Conversely, Hamilton supported a strong central government and an industrial economy, believing in the necessity of manufacturing for national growth. This divergence extended beyond their views on social structure, with Jefferson favoring egalitarianism and Hamilton accepting social and economic stratification for economic development. That argument's still going on today, and it's in the context of what's called states' rights. In 1819, we had McCulloch versus Maryland. That established that federal law is the supreme law of the land. 1857, we had the Dred Scott versus Stanford decision, which we'll talk about a little bit more in just a minute. Basically, that said that black people could never be citizens because the founders never intended them to be. And then in 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was signed into law. So, given that, let's talk about the first oligarchy, which is the... Pardon? Oh. Is that better? Okay. I could hear my echo up here, so I'm sorry. Okay, the first oligarchy, the founding fathers, and the seeds of inequality. The American Revolution, though heralded as a fight for liberty, was also rooted in an oligarchical structure. Most of the founding fathers were wealthy landowners and slaveholders, reflecting the deeply unequal society they helped to shape. I think it important to note here that many of the landowners, Jefferson included, were inheritors. They gained their farms when their fathers passed away. So, A guy by the name of Michael Korthel wrote an article, The Rise and Fall of Oligarchies in America, and he cites three major factors in the founding of the country. The first was economic inequality. Early America's economy was agrarian, dominated by a small class of wealthy landowners. Most white Americans worked as farmers, indentured service, or artisans struggling to make a living. We had racial inequality in the founding of the country. The institution of slavery entrenched a system of racial hierarchy. Enslaved black Americans were denied basic human rights and subjected to exploitation. The consequences of this system, racism, endure, shaping disparities in wealth, education, and opportunity that continue even to today. There was also political exclusion. Early republic was far from democratic. Voting rights were limited to white male property owners, excluding women, enslaved people, and most free black men and the Indians, further solidifying white control. The United States Constitution, Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, defines who can be a member of the legislature. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states, which may be included within the Union according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, and I add parentheses, men, including those bound to service for a term of years, excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. Three noteworthy observations. It does not mention women. It excludes natives, who were defined in the Declaration of Independence as savages, and everybody else is 3/5 of a person. Landowners controlled much of the country and its inhabitants. They grew crops like cotton, rice, and tobacco. Cotton was a desirable crop as it was easy to store and could be made into multiple products. But initially it was very labor intensive. Removing the seeds from the cotton boll was a real problem. But in 1793, Eli Whitney invented a tool called the cotton gin. Separated the seeds from the cotton, and suddenly this labor-intensive material, when done by hand, became quick and easy when done by machine. The plantation owners who were looking for a stable crop that can compete in the world market found that cotton provided an answer. In an agriculturally based economy, following the golden rule, who owned the land made the rules. So we had the first attempts. Post-revolutionary dreams of aristocracy. Evan Plainfield, the guy that I follow, had an article called The Original Robber Barons, Early American Oligarchs. And he said America's first would-be oligarchs emerged from the ashes of revolution, attempting to transform military victory into hereditary power. The Society of the Cincinnati, which was founded by Revolutionary War officers in 1783, represented the most organized attempt to establish an American nobility. Their hereditary membership structure, passing them from father to eldest son, so alarmed Thomas Jefferson that he warned it of becoming the germ of a hereditary aristocracy. But they weren't alone in their ambitions. The river gods of western Massachusetts controlled vast landed estates and tried to establish themselves as a regional aristocracy. Their attempts to maintain power through debt collection and political control helped spark Shays' Rebellion in 1786. The Tidewater aristocracy of Virginia, led by families like the Carters and the Lees, attempted to maintain their colonial-era power structure. While they succeeded regionally for a time, their plantation-based model proved too rigid to survive industrialization. Robert Morris, who at one time was called the financier of the Revolution, attempted to create a financial aristocracy through land speculation and war debt manipulation. He eventually went bankrupt, and that demonstrated the limitations of trying to establish European-style financial power in our young republic. So why did they fail? Well, the early attempts at establishing oligarchy power failed for several key reasons. First was the lack of an industrial base. Without modern financial instruments and an industrial infrastructure, wealth remained tied to land and too vulnerable to market fluctuations. The second was democratic sentiment. Fresh from rejecting British aristocracy, Americans were highly sensitive to any attempt at establishing hereditary privilege. 3 was the geographic expansion. The availability of Western lands made it difficult to maintain concentrated power through land ownership. 40 acres and a mule, folks. All of a sudden, everybody had land. And the last was the limited financial tools. Early American financial institutions lacked the sophistication to preserve and transfer wealth across generations. There were 36 wars that occurred during this period. Most were wars of conquest against native Indian tribes. There were 14 panics, recessions, or financial crises during the period. Banking was virtually unregulated, leading to various recessions, panics, and depressions. And the period ended with the Civil War, which ended when the South lost the war. Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation that freed the slaves. I'd like to take a little look at American theocracy, just to give you some insight as to what happened in the founding. And by the way, Cornell University has done a substantial amount of research in this. If you want to really follow this, go to the Cornell University School of Law. State-established religion was in some of the colonies, but the First Amendment says that Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or press, At least initially, the colonies largely continued the historical practice of having state-established religion in America, and in almost all cases it was the Church of England. But remember that there was a civil war in England, and there was great resistance against the Church of England in the United States. But some people, normally, again, those who had the money, wanted to continue the whole form of control that they had from the old country. The government supported and required conformity to the established church in Virginia, and church vestries exercised semi-civil political functions. Among other provisions, Virginia laws adopted in 1661 and 62 required colonists to erect churches and support ministers at public expense. The New England colonies of Plymouth, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Haven were established by Puritans who similarly provided for colonial government sponsorship of that religion. Colonies sought to establish a unified community operating according to a pure religious doctrine that followed the first plantation of the primitive church, rather than the established Church of England. In Massachusetts Bay, Puritans mandated the construction and financial support of congregational churches. A public confession of faith was necessary to become a citizen in that colony. Dissenters were punished harshly with imprisonment or expulsion, and Massachusetts executed 4 Quakers between 1658 and 1661. New York excluded Catholics from guarantees of the liberty of conscience and adopted the Ministry Act of 1693, which required the settling of a ministry. There was debate over whether this act referred only to Anglican ministers or whether the language was broad enough to allow towns to select other Protestant ministers. Maryland somewhat similarly faced pressure from the Church of England after initially tolerating more religious diversity. Lord Baltimore largely ignored his authority from England to build and dedicate Anglican churches, along with requests from Catholics for special government. In 1649, Maryland adopted the Act Concerning Religion, which guaranteed that no person professing to believe in Jesus Christ could be troubled in the free exercise of religion. but at the same time decreed strict penalties for blasphemy by non-Trinitarians. However, following political and religious upheaval in the colony in the late 1600s and early 1700s, the Maryland government adopted laws depriving Catholics of their previously held civil rights and ultimately establishing the Church of England. But all this was changed when the Bill of Rights was adopted and federal law became the supreme law of the land. So when asked the question, was the United States founded as a Christian nation, I offer the following. The following documents pretty much provide the founding beliefs and actions of the founding of the United States. They are the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, the Federalist Papers, which provide a historical record of discussions and meetings during the founding of the country. If you go through all of those documents, you will not find the word Christian. You will not find the word Christianity. And they specifically avoided using that word because of their opposition to the Church of England. And so in reference to the question, when founded, we guaranteed freedom of religion. We were not founded compliant with any religion. Okay? We can take questions on that when we get there later. Okay? How's that? If I talk right here, can you hear me? Yeah. Question. Let's see, where are we at here? Who won the Civil War? A lot of people say the North won the Civil War. Let's discuss that for a minute. In her book, How the South Won the Civil War, Heather Cox Richardson, how many of you follow Heather Cox Richardson? Yeah. Very informative, good historian. She argues otherwise. In popular literature and culture, the cowboy captivated the American imagination, but the actual history of the West aligned it closely with the Jim Crow South. As she writes, and I quote, "The resurrection of antebellum Southern ideology through the rise of the Western individualist rewrote American history. By the turn of the century, the national victory of white supremacy was complete, with Western politicians helping Southerners defeat federal bills against lynching and to ensure fair elections in the South. Following the assassination of President Lincoln, Vice President Andrew Johnson assumed the office of the presidency, and he made a decision that made perfect sense to him because he was an avowed racist, and he was a supporter of slavery. He pardoned the Confederates who tried to overthrow the government of the United States, even though that was done over the objection of Republicans at the time. And at that time, Republicans were the opponents of slavery and wanted equal rights for all. And that brought about a 20-year period that is very significant in the history of the United States. First thing, we had a Supreme Court decision, Scott v. Sanford. 3 parts to that really apply here. First of all, a free Negro whose ancestors were brought to the United States as slaves is not a citizen of the United States. Citizens' rights and privileges do not apply to those black people whose ancestors were slaves. And the only 2 clauses in the Constitution which apply to black people are treating black people as property. Number 2, Lincoln is assassinated. Johnson becomes president. Johnson attempted to eliminate the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery, the 14th Amendment, birthright citizenship, and the 15th Amendment, the right to vote. He wanted to eliminate those 3 amendments to the Constitution. And the 13th Amendment, by the way, allowed for people convicted of crimes to be put into prison and could be put into forced labor. And if you follow the history of incarceration in the South, you don't have to go very far to find that what that did. Tad Stormer wrote a book called A Resistance History of the United States. He points out that Johnson had the opportunity to forever rid the nation of slavery and to create a nation ensuring equal rights and opportunities for everyone. This failure to punish the Confederacy ensured that the Southern status quo remained in place and led to Jim Crow laws and to discrimination that continues to this day. It also established a precedent that was used to pardon Richard Nixon, and again, getting into pardons going on right now, to do so in the best interest of the country. If you couple this concept with the concept of manifest destiny, manifest destiny was not simply a cloak for American imperialism and a justification for America's territorial ambitions. It was also firmly anchored in a long-standing and deep sense of a special and unique American destiny. The belief that, in the words of historian Conrad Cherry, America is a nation called to a special destiny by God. Throughout, from then on, both Democrats and Republicans have used states' rights as an argument in support of racial discrimination and slavery. The Democrats used it consistently when they represented the South up to the mid-1960s. Then after the passage of the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts, the Democrats lost the South. It began to vote consistently Republican, and that's been the basis for just about every Republican opposition since 1968 when Nixon was elected president. Whether it be abortion, civil rights, education, or you name it, they argue that each individual state should be able to decide how it wants to proceed. And remember McCulloch versus Maryland, federal law is the supreme law of the land. I ask you to consider, what would America be like today if the Dred Scott decision ensured the rights of black people as citizens of the United States? And the Confederates that were prosecuted as war criminals waging war against the United States. How different would things be now? I have a list of presidents following Abraham Lincoln's assassination through Herbert Hoover, and a couple of the high points, and there are very few during this period of time. William McKinley, a Republican, who, by the way, was shot while he was in office, he was an absolute believer that tariffs would save the working man by protecting the Americans' jobs and protecting wages. It led to a depression by the end of his term. He was also anti-war, but he had the Spanish-American War. Because of remember the Maine and the sinking of the Maine and that, so McKinley had a war. Theodore Roosevelt, Rough Rider Teddy, he brought back the estate tax, which, by the way, was around before the founding of the country. It was called the stamp tax. When you inherited property back before the Constitution, you had to pay the stamp tax to get the stamp on the deed. And then we had, following Roosevelt, we had Taft, Woodrow Wilson, William Harding, Silent Calvin Coolidge, remember the Teapot Dome and all of that. And then we had Herbert Hoover. My advisor during my master's program was a gentleman named Von Bornett, one of the original Rand scholars, very big fish in a very small pond at Southern Oregon. And he absolutely adored Herbert Hoover. So when I sent him a graduation announcement when I was getting my doctorate, he sent me back a copy of his book on Herbert Hoover. So anyway, it's not a memorable list, and most of those people supported or at least tolerated the Jim Crow laws. Some of them, of course, were outright racist, but it was maintaining the status quo in the South. And during the period of 1836 to 1929, there were 22 panics or depressions. That was the time frame for the Indian Wars, started around Rogue River, Oregon. And many of the Indian wars were fought right here in Oregon, or against tribes who were relocated out of Oregon. It's an interesting history that you might want to read. In the 1850s, almost continual wars with the native population during the westward expansion. We drove the natives from their ancestral lands. There were at least 50 wars, and many of those were here in the Northwest. And you may wonder what happened to the fortunes of those people in the South and others. Some were lost due to mismanagement or bad choices. Some were maintained and have grown, and many of them are alive in the trust today. As we'll discuss farther on, some of these fortunes were very influential in the outcome of the 2024 election. America began a great period of industrialization with the development of railroad travel. You could go anywhere in the country with the telegraph. You could communicate instantaneously across the country. At the same time, we had laissez-faire doctrine. That was the morality of business at the time, let the buyer beware. The economy was also changing. With industrialization and mechanization, the jobs were moving from the farms to the industrial centers and the cities that surrounded them. Wealth was moving from the farms and land to factories, transportation, and banking. So that moves us into the second oligarchical era, the Gilded Age, and the rise of the robber barons. The late 19th century saw the emergence of a new group of oligarchs, industrial titans like Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, all built vast fortunes through ruthless business practices. Michael Corthell, again, the rise and fall of oligarchies in American history. One was the exploitation of labor. Workers were treated as tools. Workers endured long hours, low wages, and dangerous conditions in factories and the mines. And you can read back through accidents that happened in the mines and accidents that happened in the factories. If you got your arm cut off, well, that's too bad. Can't hire you. Okay? Right now? Okay, break time.
Here we go. We're going to start. Find your seats. Showtime. Showtime. It's all yours.
Thank you. How does this work? Can you hear me okay? Yes. Okay, good. We got 40 minutes to get through the rest of this, so I'm going to racehorse a little bit here. Regarding the oligarchs of the Gilded Age. The exploitation of labor, we've covered. The political corruption was literally everywhere. Tammany Hall, Teapot Dome. By the way, a great book, read Louisiana Hayride, talks about politics in Louisiana over that time. Basically, the corruption was everywhere, and the growing inequality, the gap between rich and poor, widened dramatically during that time. Elites lived lavishly. Many Americans faced poverty, inadequate housing, and limited access to health care. Became known as the Gilded Age. And what did we lose here? Anyway, I'll keep going and slides will catch up. The consequences of oligarchical rule are, in this time, basically war and instability. Oligarchies, by their very nature, often sow instability and conflict, as power concentrated in the hands of a few undermines equity and justice. We had the Civil War. The first American oligarchy contributed to the Civil War, deep divisions over slavery, fueled by economic and political interest of elites. Okay, well, is this better? No, how's this? Okay. We had global conflicts as the industrial oligarchs' pursuit of resources and markets drove imperial ambitions, contributing to the tensions that culminated in World Wars I and II. And it's of note here is that it's the oligarchical interest in the United States started out as being local. It was within the continent of the United States. And as it became industrialized, that becomes worldwide. It's also worthy of note that some of the oligarchs, when you're talking about global conflicts, they were selling merchandise to both sides. Basically amoral, but it's all profit-driven. And the third is the modern-day risk. They had unchecked corporate power, and it threatened global stability. Profit motives drive environmental degradation, resource wars, and geopolitical instability. What they learned from the failures of the first aristocracies is they learned that you cannot base power on land alone. And they begin basing their power on industrial control rather than land ownership. They developed more sophisticated financial instruments for the preservation of wealth. They used the corporate structure rather than hereditary titles to assume power. And they built influence through economic rather than military and social prestige. The Vanderbilts exemplified this. The Vanderbilts, unlike the failed river gods who tried to control physical territory, Cornelius Vanderbilt built power through controlling transportation networks. His son William expanded this control through sophisticated corporate structures that would have been impossible in the post-revolutionary period. Similarly, where Robert Morris's attempt at financial power failed due to primitive banking structures, J.P. Morgan succeeded by creating modern financial instruments and institutions that could weather market turbulence. I've got a list here if anybody wants to see it afterward, a whole list of the oligarchs at the time that's been identified. But anyway, that brings us to the what I call I think it's one of the nicest periods in United States history. And that's a period that many of us grew up in, because following World War II in Korea, we had the GI Bill, which helped you fund housing and helped you fund education, but we also had well-funded schools. We had a relatively fair and balanced tax structure where people, you felt, the wealthier among us, at least people felt like they were paying their fair share. And everything was just great. You know, you didn't have to pay to play football. You didn't have to pay to play in the band. All of that's around, and it was great. And we had a shared prosperity. We had Social Security that was developed earlier. We had Medicare, progressive taxation. We had worker protections, healthcare expansion, education initiatives, and we were moving towards a more inclusive society. Civil Rights Act of '64, Voting Rights Act, all of that was taking place. And then Richard Nixon was elected in 1968. Throughout the 60s, it's a period which, again, changed the course of American history. Vietnam, 3 political assassinations, Robert Kennedy, President Kennedy, Martin Luther King. And by the way, when I was at Glasgow Air Force Base the day that President Kennedy was shot, and in the Air Force, I was in data processing. And if you're not directly working on an airplane or flying an airplane, when you go into red alert, you go into what's called augmentation duty, which you're helping to defend the perimeter of the base. I was out at the flight line, close to the end of the runway when he was shot. And I wound up with an M1 rifle and 6 rounds of ammunition, guarding the back end of the runway at Glasgow Air Force Base, and it was about 24 hours before I even found out what happened. But while I was standing there, every airplane on the base took off. And if you've never seen 14 B-52s in an orchestrated takeoff, it's really impressive. Anyway, that's just a side note of what happened there. We had the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act. We had protests against the war. I'm still a little mad that the Democrats nominated Hubert Humphrey instead of Eugene McCarthy. I was a Eugene McCarthy fan. And I've got to tell you one other story, and this is the way, and I'm going to tie this in later to the way people think during elections. My mother voted for Hubert Humphrey. You know why she voted for Hubert Humphrey? Because she knew a lady who used to live across the street from Hubert Humphrey. And one day Hubert got in trouble, and so he went and hid underneath the porch. And people were searching all around looking for Hubert, and he came out from under the porch and said, "Here I am." And my mother thought that was really cute, and so she voted for Hubert Humphrey. Okay, along that same line, Nixon gets elected. Spiro Agnew's forced to resign in a plea deal. Nixon winds up resigning. Ford pardons Nixon. Very important thing that happened, and I tie that right back to Andrew Johnson pardoning the Confederacy. That's the precedent that was set. And the Iranians overthrow the Shah of Iran and take Americans hostage. All that happened. 1980, Ronald Reagan is elected president. At the time he took office, the federal deficit was less than $1 trillion. So let me catch up with the slides here. Okay. Reagan introduced the concept of supply-side economics, that incentives matter, high tax rates are bad for growth, and inflation is fundamentally a monetary phenomena. Consequently, there is no longer any meaningful difference between supply-side economics and Main Street economics. Today, that concept has become associated with an obsession for cutting taxes under all circumstances. No longer do its advocates in Congress and elsewhere confine themselves to cutting marginal tax rates, the tax on each additional dollar earned, as the original supply-siders did. Rather, they now support even the gimmickest, economically dubious tax cuts with the same intensity. And today it is common to hear tax cutters claim implausibly that all tax cuts raise revenue. And the federal deficit is now $37 trillion. By the way, I have a note here, good time for a break. Okay, let's take a look at the coming of the third oligarchy. When we have new technologies, processes, and opportunities, creative people will find ways to turn a profit. With the development of new machines and technologies we have today, troubling signs point to the emergence of a third American oligarchy, echoing the patterns from the first. Soaring inequality. What'd you think of Jeff Bezos and his wedding? Just for an example of that. And how do you think the average person looks at that? We have corporate dominance now. We've allowed mergers to where, and I'm going to give you some examples later, excuse me, but we have just a few corporations dominating key industries, stifling competition, and exacerbating income inequality. The political influence of money, Citizens United, and those things we're going to talk about. Campaign financing and lobbying, giving corporations and wealthy individuals outsized influence, undermining democracy. We have the erosion of workers' rights, declining union membership, weakened labor laws, leaves workers vulnerable to exploitation. Here we go again. And profit is the primary focus of corporations. Remember when you could walk into Meyer and Frank and go to the shoe department and the salesperson knew the products that they had available? You don't see that anymore. Now it's purely profit. And I did some research on risk management and theft. And some of these corporations have determined that it's cheaper to just absorb the losses from theft than it is to pay the labor that it takes to avoid that theft. Because it's all about the money. I call it the corporatization of America. Consolidation has placed great power in the hands of the few. And who owns those corporations? Primary owners are the people we're talking about, the oligarchs. So the architecture of control then and now. Let's see. Yeah, here we go. We have interlocking power now from the boardrooms to the algorithms. In 1904, 8 families controlled 112 major corporations, primarily through interlocking directorates. It seemed like the peak of concentrated power. Today's concentration makes that look quaint. Here's some examples. Blackguard, Vanguard, and State Street together control $20 trillion in assets. These big three are the largest shareholders in 88% of the Standard & Poor's 500. Just 30 people control companies worth over $50 trillion. 3 tech companies, Apple, Microsoft, and Alphabet, have more combined market value than the gross domestic product of France. Where the robber barons pioneered basic trust, today modern financial mechanisms deploy far more sophisticated tools. There's the algorithmic control. BlackRock's Aladdin software manages $21.6 trillion in assets. It makes over 250,000 daily portfolio trades. It influences pricing across the entire markets in the country and is used by 85% of the top asset managers. You have the dark money networks. You have 501c4 organizations, which in the 2020 election spent over $1 billion on that election. You have shell company networks where you can hide trillions of dollars in wealth. We have single-family offices that manage over $7 trillion globally. And we have private equity firms, control companies employing 11.7 million Americans. And the interlocking influence, the tech giants share board members with defense contractors. Major media companies interlock with the tech platforms. Financial firms cross-pollinate with regulatory agencies. Go to government, work for a while. Go to the company, work for a while. Companies being investigated, go back to government, work for a while. And think tanks are funded by overlapping donor networks. We have a data dominance, modern concentration of power by the numbers. The top 1% owns more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. 10 asset firms, management firms, control $40 trillion worth of assets. 5 tech companies control 43% of all digital advertising. 3 companies control 80% of cloud computing. 2 companies process 90% of all credit card transactions. Okay, I'll be back. I got ahead of myself here. So that brings us to the new aristocracy. Like their Gilded Age predecessors, today's oligarchs create mechanisms to preserve power. Corporate structure. Dual class shares between Facebook, Google, Snap, for example. Complex holding company arrangements. You scratch my back. All of that. Cross-ownership networks and special purpose acquisition companies. The political architecture, super PACs, the think tanks, lobbying firms, K Street lives, policy planning groups, and media ownership. Wealth preservation, and you have dynasty trust. You know what a dynasty trust is? When trusts originated and were founded, they had an expiration date, which was usually 4 generations, 80 years, 90 years. And at the end of that period, that trust had to be dissolved to where those assets, the combined assets, were divided among the heirs. A dynasty trust never expires. It just continues to grow. And so the influence and the wealth and all of that never expires for your family. Basically, it creates not quite a House of Lords kind of control, but pretty close. It's like royalty, you know. The scale of modern concentration makes the robber barons look like small time, where John D. Rockefeller Standard Oil controlled 90% of American oil refining. Today's tech giants control not just markets, but they control the infrastructure of our lives. Basically, our communications, our data, our financial transactions are increasingly our thoughts and behaviors. Do any of you know anything about Palantir? Okay. Robert Reich, little short guy, he's very short, wrote a history called The Short History of the United States. Has a good sense of humor, but he's also served in government for years in a variety of positions. He's now a full professor at Cal Berkeley. He published a report, How You Can Stop Peter Thiel's Palantir, and it's entirely relevant to what we're discussing today. So allow me to quote from that article. As I have written, Palantir is at the nexus of several worrisome realities: artificial intelligence, Trump's use of the military on American civilians, his attack on immigrants, his collection of personal information on millions of Americans, and the parts of Silicon Valley dedicated to turning the U.S. from a democracy into a dictatorship led by the tech bros. Palantir sells an artificial intelligence-based platform that allows its users, among them military and law enforcement, to analyze personal data, including social media profiles, personal information, and physical characteristics. These are used to identify and surveil individuals. In March, Trump signed an executive order requiring all agencies and departments of the federal government to share data on Americans to get the job done. Trump chose Palantir, and this shows you how much business Palantir is doing with the United States federal government. And I also feel compelled to point out when Doge went in and you had those people on the computers, which company did they come from? The amount of information that they have on us is scary. Okay? According to the New York Times, Palantir software may now be used to combine data gleaned from the Homeland Security, Department of Defense, Department of Health and Human Services, Social Security Administration, and the Internal Revenue Service. Meanwhile, the administration wants access to citizens and others' bank account numbers and medical claims. The danger inherent in Palantir's AI-powered super database on all Americans is connected to the vast wealth and power of those associated with the corporation and their apparent disdain for democratic institutions. Elon Musk was behind Palantir's selection for the project. At least 3 Doge members had worked at Palantir, but Times reported, while others had worked at companies funded by Peter Thiel, an investor and a founder of Palantir who still holds a major stake. Thiel has worked closely with Musk and mentored J.D. Vance, who worked for Thiel at one time of his venture funds. Thiel introduced Vance to Trump and later helped Vance become vice president. The CEO of Palantir is Alex Karp, who said on an earnings call earlier this year, the company wants to disrupt and make the institutions we partner with the very best in the world, and when it's necessary, to scare enemies and on occasion kill them. This group, including Thiel, Musk, Karp, and Vance, doesn't seem to want to conserve much of anything, at least not of anything that occurred after the 1920s. That includes Social Security, civil rights, and even women's rights to vote. As Thiel has written, the 1920s were the last decade in American history during which one could be genuinely optimistic about politics. Since 1920, the vast increase in welfare beneficiaries and the extension of the franchise to women, 2 constituencies that are notoriously tough for libertarians, have rendered the notion of capitalist democracy into an oxymoron. Reich says if capitalistic democracy is becoming an oxymoron, it's not because of public assistance or because women got the right to vote. It's because billionaire capitalists like Musk and Thiel are intent on killing democracy. Not incidentally, the 1920s marked the last gasp of the Gilded Age, when America's robber barons ripped off so much of the nation's wealth that the rest of the U.S. had to go deep into debt to both maintain their standard of living and overall demand for the goods and services the nation produced. When that debt bubble burst in 1929, we got the Great Depression, Benito Mussolini, Adolf Hitler, etc. If we learned anything from the first Gilded Age and the fascism that grew like a cancer in the 1930s, it should have been that gross inequalities of income and wealth fuel abuses of political power. That in turn generates strong men who destroy both democracy and freedom. How this story ends, by the way, is going to be up to all of us. I want to spend a few minutes now on how we became so polarized as a country. I'm sure you're all familiar with the term divide and conquer. And I'm sure many of you are asking, what's going on now and how did this happen? Well, I'd like to begin with, you guys remember who Grover Norquist was? Yeah, tax guy in the 1980s. He advised the Republican Party in the mid-1980s that it would be beneficial to Republicans if every time they mentioned a Democrat, they didn't just say that they were a Democrat. He recommended using terms like radical socialist Democrat, or communist, or left-wing radical, but always introduce a Democrat with some negative or derogatory term included in that introduction. And things kind of cruised along, but in 1996, I consider it to be a real turning point in American history. 1996 is when Fox News went on the air. It was originally designed to be a counterpoint to what was seen as the liberal news media of the day. And then it over time became a little bit more extreme. And remember the election, the 2020 election, and the claims that were being made on Fox about Dominion voting systems? Fox News, they were sued by Dominion voting systems. And last year, rather than go to court, they settled. Fox paid $787 million. And the reason they paid, rather than going to trial, is that Dominion could prove that Fox News knowingly and intentionally lied about the election and about Dominion voting systems. Also in 1996, Rush Limbaugh went national. Something that I think is important, really important. Remember Newt Gingrich? He was reelected Speaker of the House, and he had started this in 94, but in 96, and there were people in the Republican Party that were really upset because Clinton would not invade Iraq. Gingrich decided and developed his contract with America. And that contract with America stated that no bill will pass the House of Representatives without Republican majority support. That is, if the majority of Republicans did not like the bill, it would never pass the House of Representatives. In 1996, Osama bin Laden declared war against the United States. There was also an organization formed, which some of my colleagues don't think it's very important. I still think it's very important. The organization was called the Project for the New American Century. Have any of you heard of it? Pardon? Yeah, okay, I thought maybe I was getting ahead of myself. The Project for the New American Century was formed. It had three main goals. It wanted the United States to control energy, outer space, and military dominance of the world. Their stated goal was to promote American global leadership. They wanted American leadership as good for both America and for the world, and they sought to build support for the Reaganite policy of military strength and moral clarity. There were 25 original people who signed the founding document of principles. 10 of those people went on to serve in the administration of George W. Bush, including Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, and Paul Wolfowitz. Observers such as Erwin Steiser and David Grondin have suggested that the organization played a key role in shaping the foreign policy of the Bush administration, particularly in the invasion of Iraq. Also in '96, Clinton wins re-election, and that's the year he hired Monica Lewinsky. And then, of course, in 2000, George W. Bush becomes president, and you have the Twin Towers and all of that follows. The continuation from that, we have the invasion of Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq. Bush founds the Transportation Security Administration, which at the time was the largest single growth of an organization in American history within the government, and the federal deficit continues to grow. Now, continuing the pattern, what links the failed river gods to today's tech billionaires is a consistent drive to transform economic power into lasting social and political control. The methods have evolved from hereditary military societies to algorithm-driven monopolies. The goal remains the same. This evolution shows something crucial about American oligarchy. Each generation learns from the failures of its predecessors. The river gods' failed attempt at landed aristocracy informed the robber barons' more sophisticated industrial power, which in turn taught today's tech oligarchs how to build even more durable forms of control. So let's talk about the election. The following is from a paper by the Americans for Tax Fairness entitled Businesses Buying Elections. They've come to collect. Here are some facts from the election. Just 100 billionaire families spent $2.6 billion into federal elections in 2024. That's one of every $6 spent in the entire election came from the oligarchs. Billionaire political spending is up 160-fold since Citizens United. The vast bulk of billionaire family donations went to so-called independent expenditure groups, which, thanks to Citizens United, can raise unlimited amounts of money from each donor, rather than money directly to candidates or parties, which still work under the campaign contribution law. Billionaire spending heavily favored Republicans. About 2/3, 70% of that money went to the Republican Party, and less than a quarter backed Democrats, and about the remainder went to committees without a clear partisan or ideological identity. In the 3 Senate races that gave Republicans control of the Senate, billionaire giving constituted a huge amount of Republican outside spending. In Montana, it was 58%, Pennsylvania 56%, and Ohio 44%. Almost 3/4 of the total amount used by outside spending groups to attack representative presidential candidate Kamala Harris came from billionaires. Billionaires supplied over 3/5 of all the outside dollars spent praising Donald Trump. While the political undue influence on government policy of billionaire donors has always been a concern, the second Trump administration has seen a blatant and unprecedented swapping of campaign contributions for political power, most notoriously in the case of Elon Musk. The Trump-Musk attempt to dismantle the federal government and the Republican tax-cutting agenda could potentially save billionaire family donors trillions of dollars in taxes, turning a huge profit on their investment. In summary, the billionaires continue to drown out a democracy with money, with just the top 100 political donor families pouring $2.6 billion into the 24 federal election, more than doubled the amount donated by Americans oligarchs in the 2020 election. Okay? How much time do I have? 4 minutes. Okay. Oh. Okay, let's move on to how do you break the pattern? Oh, okay, good, thank you. Understanding this evolution from the failed post-revolutionary attempts through the robber baron is crucial for addressing modern-day concentrations of power. The basic concept is those who don't study history are bound to repeat it. And 2, history repeats. And it's kind of fun. Go back and look at the 1720s, the 1820s, and the 1920s. You know, I don't want to get into some of the games that are played online, But there are some remarkable similarities to look at. One of the things I want to spend some time on is a very influential book for me in my undergraduate days was by Eric Hoffer. It is called The True Believer. And what Hoffer deals with is the mindset. Why do people become so radically involved in an organization? And it generally means they're, one, very discontented. They don't like the way things are going. They have this desire for change, and they feel that they are totally neutered, that they have no power doing much of anything. Most of them have manifestos, and I offer this one just to give you one example. This is the Ku Klux Klan's manifesto in the late 1800s. Are you opposed to Negro equality? Are you in favor of a white man's government? Are you in favor of a constitutional liberty, government of equitable laws? That's states' rights is what they were after. Are you in favor of the re-enfranchisement and emancipation of the white men of the South? Do you believe the inalienable right of self-preservation of the people against the exercise of governmental power? The Klan, y'all, I believe you know that Oregon, by law, did not allow black people to live here. I watched the Klan march in Grants Pass. Oh, I'm sorry. I watched the Ku Klux Klan march in Grants Pass in 1948. Old enough to remember that. And that has had a tremendous influence on Oregon. Many of the people who settled in Southern Oregon were from the South. They came up after World War II because of the timber, because the jobs were in the logging industry, and that's what they knew. Anyway, trying to think, I've got time to make one point here. So what can you do to get through all of this? First of all, we need to find our common ground. We need to work together as a nation. We need to get past the name calling. We need to get past the my side, your side. We're not at war over various things that the news media might call a war. But I believe that there's extremes on both sides, and that's about 1/3 of the population of the United States. And the other 2/3 is in the middle. And you just want to have a nice life. You know, you want to have a job, you want to be able to retire, you want to own a house, 3-bedroom, 1-bath, white picket fence. That was the dream in the 50s. I think that's where most of America is now. And if we start there with what we're going to do, we will be fine. It may seem impossible to imagine the government without two leading political parties, but in 1787, when delegates to the Constitution gathered in Philadelphia, they entirely omitted political parties from the new government and the new documents. It's no accident the framers of the Constitution desperately wanted to avoid the divisions that brought about the Civil War in England in the 17th century. Many of them saw parties, or factions as they called them then, as corrupt relics of the previous British system, and they wanted to discard that. Willard Stern Randall, professor at Champlain, it was not that they didn't think of parties, just the idea of a party brought back bitter memories to some of them. And that's because the very nature of this brings about it becomes divisive when it's my side against your side. And we ought to be looking at what's best for all of us. What do we do? And so I suggest first of all, we need to look at the civil society, faith groups, universities. We got to get rid of campaign financing that makes you beholden to donors. I don't know if you do that with state-funded elections or federally funded elections, but we got to get the money out of politics. It's killing us. We need to hold our leaders accountable, and of course supporting candidates that prioritize equity and justice, but we need to become politically aware. And that's education. That's exactly where I'm going with this. We need to find reliable sources for news and for information. And without that, we're going to continue down this long road. But if we can make people aware of what's really happening, get out, find out the hidden agendas that are going on. And by the way, politicians are famous for creating diversions. And the American public is sometimes like your pet dog, you know, squirrel, go that way, and then raccoon, go that way. It's knee-jerk reaction, and we don't look at the long-term implications. And that's the second thing that I want to approach here, is we as a people and as a government have got to start thinking long-term. The reason our infrastructure is going to pieces now is because in the 70s and in the 80s, we quit developing, we quit maintaining. I know from my own experience at the University of Portland, preventive maintenance is the most important thing. It's so much cheaper every 10 years to spray another coat on the roof of the child center than it is to wait 15 years and have to replace the roof. And that's what we've done with so many things. Look what China has done with its infrastructure in the last 20 years compared to what have we done with our infrastructure. Very, very important. There's a call for unionization. I like the idea of labor representation, but I think back to some of the railroad situations, some of the claims that Jimmy Hoffa, things that he wanted to do, so I'm a little cautious about unions. But the idea of union being able to organize, labor being able to organize, I strongly support. We've got to get back to progressive taxation. And that begins with, we need to redefine what constitutes income. Because so much of what's income now is guaranteed, comes through capital gains. And you can use your capital gains as equity for a loan, but you don't pay capital gains tax until after you actually cash in. And so you have situations now, and if there's a tax accountant out there, please help me with this. My understanding is that I form a company and I put the ownership of that into the family trust, and then I die. Am I done? Okay. The growth, the capital gains are never paid, taxes are never paid on those capital gains, and that's a concern. So anyway, in conclusion with this, it's all out there, folks. The history of American oligarchies serves as a cautionary tale. Concentrated wealth and power threaten democracy, deepen inequality, and breed instability. And so I offer you this from the Declaration of Independence. When a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I have the first question. My name is Franca Hernandez, and my question is, back when you were referring to the wealthy families, the oligarchs, and who were very, very wealthy here in the United States, my understanding is that a lot of these families also set up foundations that benefit, OPB and other charitable organizations. So it wasn't just predatory. I mean, they did turn their money around and benefit the regular folks, the common folks. So what do you have to say about that?
Great. I mean, you can certainly, I think it's wonderful if you do something with the money for the common good. The point I'm trying to make is not all of that money goes for the common good. And that's where I'm at.
Hello, my name's Mark. As you gave your presentation, I thought about the foundation of these oligarchies, the first being supplying food and resources to society, the second providing goods to society, and now this third one providing services and information to society. I thought about the fourth oligarchy to come in the future, which might be AI-driven and algorithmically driven, like they pointed out, where machines might become the fourth oligarchy. What's your thoughts on how algorithms will create this next oligarchy that we will encounter, our children will encounter?
Wow. Been reading your science fiction? I'm serious, because that's exactly what much of science fiction's predicting. I don't have an answer for you, though. I haven't done anything with that.
Here you go.
This is Paul. I just wanted to see what your take is on the election of the mayor of New York, as opposed to something that was against someone outlier versus big money.
I'll freely admit I don't know enough about it. I know what I've seen on the news, but I am so skeptical of what I read on the news. If I don't really look it up, I don't know. He was elected by a majority. We'll see what he does. I don't put a whole lot of credence in what people say when they're running for office. I wait until they're there, and then let's see what they do, and that's when I form my opinions.
Thank you for being here today. My name's Michelle. Thank you for being here today. So I agree with your long-term recommendations. Based on your vast experience and historical knowledge, what actions do you recommend in this moment of clear and present crisis in our country?
Wow. I don't think there's an immediate fix to what's going on, and the reason I say that is there is so much going in front of the Supreme Court now over actions being taken by the current administration. I'm disappointed in the Supreme Court and its shadow docket that they will make a preliminary ruling on something or allow something to continue with no explanation. And that bothers me greatly. But much of what's been done in Project 2025 is legal. The people that put that together, they had at least 4 years, 3.5 years to plan it for Project 2050. This is really orchestrated, very carefully put together. The only real fix is going to be the elections. And that's a ways away yet, yeah.
just a quick follow-up. My personal take on this is not to wait until the elections, to peacefully engage in action now. Join some affinity groups. Stand up, get out, speak out now, peacefully and loudly, in any way you can.
Oh, yeah, well, yes. I'm sorry, that was actually part of what I was going to present before I had to rush it, and that's that to make change happen in 2020, in the election in November, it's past time to start planning now and to start organizing now to get it done. Change doesn't happen overnight. But hopefully you can recruit people for your cause and do it now. Yeah.
I guess I have to make an observation here, and that's, I agree with the lady on the front row there, that this is the time to act. But I want to say that, since what we consider to be normal has been completely torn apart, and I don't believe that there's the slightest chance that we can go back to anything that any of us would have called normal. That time has seen its end. In the case of Mr. Mondani, I think that right now we're starting this rebuild period, I hope, and that we're going to see a lot of people like him come up with their ideas, and some of them are going to fail. It's just not going to work. And maybe his will, and maybe his won't. Maybe there will be plenty of other people. There's certainly vast quantities of Democrats who are saying things, and some of their ideas will hold and others won't. But it's up to us to keep the momentum going.
Do you have any closing?
Pray.
Oh, I'm sorry. There's a question over here.
I'm Ann, and I think this is part of what we've been talking about, but my sense is that in the United States we don't sufficiently appreciate the importance of local elections. That's where any kind of organization and energy really gets started. Would you tend to agree that one of the things we have to do is to persuade people who fail to turn out for mayoral elections and midterm elections like the one that's coming up, because they only look at the presidency. They don't visualize where the power is farther down the line. Do you have any ideas on how we can work on that?
All government begins locally, and if you don't organize locally, you'll never get anywhere. I'm sorry, I'm thinking of a closing remark here, but we have one more question.
Oh, okay. Well.
Hi, this is Dave. You mentioned generational change. I would advocate for gender change. We need more women running for office, heading up corporations, and male supremacy has clearly failed.
Amen. Amen.
Okay.
Go, Dave. Okay, one more.
Hello, my name is Sheila, and I just want to remind everybody that this organization allows thoughts from all parties and all people, and that in the past I have heard complaints that we lean one way and not the other. So I want to keep that in mind as we're sharing ideas about working together and asking questions, but being open to not excluding and just supporting the ideas that we have in our own head. Because there are people that want to join in the conversation, and they sometimes have felt excluded in this organization. And I know that, I've heard that. So just the thought that we don't all have to think exactly the same way to make good progress. So please keep that in mind. Thank you.
Do you have anything?
Okay, in closing, yeah, I've been fighting this all day. Maybe this is better. Okay. One of the competitions that is inherent with politics is your perspective of your society. If you think of our society as being a we society, then you're looking at all of us being members. If you're looking at society as being a me society, you're looking out for your individual interest and not necessarily the interest of what's good for everybody else. The very nature of governance and politics will generate competing ideas. To govern requires compromise, and that's something that we don't see going on in Washington, D.C. right now. And as I pointed out, that specifically, very specifically, started out in 1996 with that Contract for America. We need to elect people, and I personally, it's fine with me to elect people with competing or differing interests. That's America. But they need to learn to talk to each other and to compromise. For example, the federal government hasn't had a federal government pass in entirety since the mid-1990s. They are required to. The president submits a budget in March, and by September, the government is required to send a budget for the funding of the entire federal government. And we're not doing that. And the reason is that it exposes where all the money's going to. And so they do it with resolutions, continuing resolutions, and that's the way legislation is passed. That's not the way to govern. That gets back to my long-range thinking. Anyway, I want to thank you very much for the opportunity to stand up here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming.